where did you go to school?
I went first to a junior college near St. Louis called Monticello Junior College. Then I went to Washington University in St. Louis.
Okay.
And got my undergraduate degree in geology.
Okay.
And after that, I went to Harvard. I got in as a graduate student on the National Defense Education Act grant, which was wonderful. And I didn't know really what I wanted to do, except that I had this geological background. I'd been reading National Geographics and books and all kinds of things about human evolution and paleontology, and I'd had some great courses in paleo. So when I arrived there, it wasn't like I had already picked out a project to do.
But to go back to WashU, why did you decide on WashU, and why do you think they decided on you?
Well, I had a wonderful geology course when I was at the junior college.
Okay.
And then I thought I was going to be an artist, actually. That was my main interest when I was growing up, along with science. And my father encouraged that. He tragically passed away when I was age 14. And
I'm sorry.
Because he was so interested in science, I think that actually helped to propel me into doing that as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
So... but I thought I was going to be an artist, but Washington University didn't have much of a program in fine arts, and they did have a great program in geology, so
right.
I
And were you a good scholar?
A good scholar?
When you were in high school?
Oh, yes, I got, yes.
Nice.
I actually graduated a year early, and that's why my mother thought I wasn't ready for the big time.
Oh, so that's why you went to junior college?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see.
And I had a little scholarship there. I mean, since my father passed away, and she had to raise 3 kids and get us all, out into the world. Yeah.
And so when you went to Harvard, you applied to work with a particular individual?
I didn't. No. And Brian Patterson, who was there and who had been working in East Africa, took me on as his graduate student. And I don't really know the history behind that, but...
what was the PhD program?
It was in the Department of Geosciences.
Okay.
But he was a vertebrate paleontologist. Right. Al Romer was there, famous vertebrate paleontologist. Right. Ernst Mayr was there, evolutionary biologist. They had a really strong program that included paleontology at the time, and Steve Gould actually was there, came in the same year I did.
Okay. And what was the balance of males and females in the class?
I was the only female
you were the
grad
only
student in my entry year, and then there were 1 or 2 others that came along, but basically very few role models of that kind, of that gender, and yet, I mean, Brian Patterson gave me every opportunity, and including, the opportunity to start work in East Africa, and his interest in human evolution too.
I only met him a couple of times, but he seemed to me to be an extremely, sort of the uncle that you would wish that you'd had. He seemed to be a very decent, warm, smart guy.
Very smart. He had worked his way up without getting a legitimate college degree to be the Agassiz professor, and you could do that in those days. I mean, there's a long story there, but I won't get into it. It'll take the rest of the time if I try to. But he also was very hands-off. I mean, I learned more from the other graduate students that he had around him directly. But I found out later that when I was, kind of a different sort of graduate student, and there was some bias against women as well, that he defended me and helped where.
So he helped behind the scenes.
He definitely helped behind the scenes, and I remember one time I needed a letter of recommendation for something, and he told me he'd written a letter that would get me into heaven. He had that kind of humor, and everybody loved Pat. I mean, he had a wonderful sense of humor. But he was not a hands-on details kind of person for his students. And so we all kind of banded together, and he had classes at his home, and he made us feel like a community and passed on a lot of knowledge. But at the time when I entered graduate school, he had decided he would not ever work in East Africa again because he had fallen out with Louis Leakey over the deposits and the fossils from the Turkana Basin.
Okay, so he joined a long list of people who. And what was the topic of your PhD?
When I'll step back a little bit because I was coming in from geology, but I was very interested in paleontology, and I became interested in human evolution because I took a course from William Howells,
right,
who was there at the time, and there was just this ferment of discovery post Olduvai, and the Leakeys finding things in East Africa, and so it was a hot topic at the time, and so in my very first committee meeting with Al Romer, Brian Patterson, Steve Gould, Ray Seaver, who is a sedimentologist, and maybe some other people, I was sitting there and they said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, I would like to be interdisciplinary.
Right.
And they looked at me, like, okay, you have these ideals, but I was told that I had to specialize. If I was going to be in vertebrate paleontology, I would have to find a group, a kind of animal to work on, and, narrow my focus. And I was a little put off by that, but, here were these luminaries in the field, so I couldn't really
and Al Romer tells you've got to... Yeah.
I'm not sure which one of them told me that. So, but I just didn't take that advice, basically, even though, looking back on it, I was rather forthright of me, I guess you could say, or maybe even a little arrogant, but I wanted to figure out what was happening with the context of the fossil record.
So you were more interested in process than in the
objects.
The objects.
Right. Okay. And from my field work I was in a field camp in Montana, and I'd gotten very, very interested at the geological side of things, but then I wanted to see how the fossils related to that. And so it seemed like fertile ground to take that into the world of human evolution and figure out how the human fossil remains and their ancestors related to the environments and the rocks that represented those environments. So that's what my thesis topic ended up being, although...
what was it called?
The taphonomy and paleoecology of the Lake Turkana now, but it was Lake Rudolph at the time, fossil record.
So you went up to Turkana as a graduate student?
Well, I first went to Lothicum Hill with Vince Maglio, who was a more senior graduate student with Brian Patterson. He was studying elephant evolution. And this mandible, I've just got a cast of it, this little hominid mandible with one tooth presented a lot of problems and enigmas because there just wasn't quite enough to say what hominin it was, especially at that time. And the age was a problem.
Nobody really believed there were hominins at that time. So,
right. Well, this was initially... Brian Patterson had been working in what he thought were Miocene deposits, and then they turned out to be Pliocene deposits, which were later in time and getting closer to the story of human evolution as it was known then. This was in the late 60s. And so this mandible he found, Brian Patterson did, at Lothicum Hill, which is southwest of Lake Turkana. And this was partly what led to the falling out with Louis Leakey, along with some other fossils from a place called Canapoy. And so Patterson was very lucky in finding these. And there were lots of other fossil animals as well. So his grad student, Vince Maglio, needed to go back to Lothagam, and Patterson wanted me to go back to look into more of the geology and the dating, because they didn't really have the stratigraphy settled, and they, in those days, potassium argon dating was in a fairly early state as well. So I had to raise money myself, some of my own personal money, to go over that first time. And Vince and I went with 2 crew members, and we spent 5 weeks at Lothagam in the fall of 1968. I met Richard Leakey at that point.
So you were in Lothagam when I was in East Rudolph, as
Yeah.
was. Well, I never.
These are fun discoveries, aren't they?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was over there, and it was a real adventure, because the local people there, the Turkana, had not really seen white people and researchers of any kind, and they were very curious. And it was hot, and it was buggy, and it was a windswept desert with these amazing outcrops with fossils in them. So I did a geological map, and figured out the stratigraphy, and we collected a lot more fossils. And I met Richard after that, and he asked me right away, I don't know, he must have talked to Vince or someone, if I would be interested in joining his project the next year.
And at that time, Vince was already the elephant president?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he was well along.
Okay.
And he was a very important mentor. He taught comparative anatomy that I took as a TA, and you know, he was already doing this work, and I had not collected vertebrate fossils or doing that. I didn't know anything about that. So
so that was the Vince part.
Yeah.
And then when did you defend your thesis?
1973.
Oh, so right.
And during that time, you know, Vince helped me, and other people helped me, and Richard Leakey really helped as well. He provided so many opportunities for me, and he asked lots of hard questions too. And he was skeptical about this, you know, idea of taphonomy and how things become fossil, and then all the biases that I was trying to figure out. But I set up this way of collecting where it was, you collected everything, not just the things you were interested in, by laying out squares, which you helped with. Yes, the 10 by 10 meter squares.
Oh, God, the 10 by 10 meter squares.
And the outcrops, you know, along particular strata, so you could be sure of some control.
Even if the square was under a wait-a-bit tree.
Yeah, oh yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I remember, okay.
Yeah, well.
Okay.
But it was a systematic way of getting a sample that was comparable at different times in different places and different environments. So that helped to show that the fossil vertebrates were actually pretty faithful to the different environments, like a channel deposit versus a lake margin versus a floodplain. And the hominins fit into that as well. We even found some on our squares. And so, yeah. And then, but all the way through that, Patterson was supporting me. None of my advisors ever went out in the field with me, but Glenn Isaac, this wonderful archaeologist who was also multidisciplinary, I was working with him on some of the archaeological sites, and he became my mentor, really.